Once More with Feeling by Wetpretzel, read by Alex Mabella. Chapter 6 February 1979. This was absolutely useless. Hermione's fourth time scoring the only book the library had on wizarding monarchs throughout history, and there wasn't so much as a footnote regarding a half-blood prince, legitimate or otherwise. Hermione slammed the heavy book shut and immediately winced at the loud thwack it made throughout the stacks. A group of 7th-year Ravenclaws looked over at her from their table. Combined look of disdain, derision, and from one particularly stressed-looking witch, seemingly moments away from hexing her as her little outburst had disturbed them from revising for their quickly approaching news. Hermione blushed sheepishly and nodded her head in apology as she quickly turned on her heels and darted around the stacks. She cornered another row, and then one more, until she was certain she had put considerable distance between her and the temperamental study group. She was at the back of the library now, the imposing doors of the restricted section looming just ahead of her. A wistful, bitter sigh escaped her as she pondered the possibilities that the information that she needed was only a couple yards behind those ancient oak doors. Hermione had tried pleading with Madame Pince a few weeks earlier to let her browse the section, but the librarian had simply sneered at her, like Hermione was something foul stuck to the bottom of the miserable witch's pointed heel, and told her to not make silly requests like that until she had a written approval from her Dada professor, per Hogwarts policy. At the image of Hermione approaching Professor Snape after class, the one teacher in school who did not consider Hermione's dedication to her studies to be considered anything remotely worthy of respect, and asking him to give her permission to explore the restricted stacks to try and find any sort of proof that the shady wizard Harry was using to cheat in class with even existed, had made Hermione snort in derision. No, it seemed Hermione would have to fall back onto the one thing she could always count on in times of uncertainty, her brain. Hermione glanced at her surroundings, walking around the aisles until she found an empty table so that she could focus. To her displeasure, it seemed like the majority of the 7th-year students had decided to take that Saturday as an extra day to cram in as much revision as possible. She huffed quietly. Perhaps she should return in the evening when everyone else was at dinner? Her mind trailed off as she spotted an empty table barely visible, crammed around the damp corner at the farthest part of the library. She smiled in relief. Her footsteps quiet but quickly striding towards the corner, her hands reached to relieve her achy shoulder of a heavy bag. Hermione froze, her bag slamming back down quite painfully on her hip as she discovered the table was not as empty as it appeared to be. Malfoy was sat at the table, his head laid across his arms, no doubt in the middle of a frustrated tiff Hermione herself was quite familiar with. Hang on, was he sleeping? The steady rise and fall of his shoulders, the even, deep exhale of his breath, in contrast to the deep purple bruising under his eyes, a peaceful, relaxed openness to his face Hermione had never seen before, all indicated he was, indeed, asleep. Hermione's head tilted in curiosity as she couldn't help but observe him. He looked much younger when he was sleeping. Her cheeks bloomed in color as a devilish thought in the back of her mind commented that he was rather good-looking when his face wasn't pinched up into a scowl. The small fabric crease indentations on his cheeks indicated he had been sleeping there for a while now, and Hermione shifted on her feet as she debated as to whether she should wake him up. Maybe he'd be so disgusted at breathing the same air as a mudblood he would storm off, and Hermione would have a lovely empty table all to herself. Her lips twitched in amusement until Harry's remark about Malfoy disappearing from the map at night, rarely ever being in the comfort of his dormitory, flashed in her mind. Her brows furrowed together as she looked at him more closely. He really did look exhausted. Hermione couldn't help the disbreathing purse of her lips as she wondered if that was the first time that Malfoy had slept all week. She glanced over her shoulder. All of the other tables were still full of anxious, irritable students. She turned back and chewed on her lip anxiously. He was asleep after all. It wasn't like he could cause any harm to her. Not that she was worried about such a thing, as the delightful memory of her hand slapping his cheek sprang to her mind. And if Hermione was quiet, she could make her notes and simply slip away. Malfoy never had to know she was there. Her mind made up, she quietly slipped into the seat across from him and gently placed her back on the table, her hand reaching in to pull out a roll of parchment and her quill and ink. Hermione had barely written a couple of bullet points before Harry's suspicion ran through her mind again. The idea of Malfoy being a Death Eater was laughable, yet, as a sickly, burning sensation bloomed in her stomach, Hermione couldn't help but think of poor Katie Bell's accident. Malfoy abandoning his prefect responsibilities when he'd taken great joy abusing them their previous school year. Him barely showing up to any classes. Even in potions, the one subject Hermione was sore to admit that he bested her in, a rarity she knew he took great pride in, it all appeared like Malfoy just couldn't bring himself to care anymore. Of course it didn't mean he was a Death Eater, for crying out loud. Perhaps he was depressed. Hermione looked over at his dark circles again. She knew that insomnia could trigger depression. It was much more plausible that Malfoy was just going through some stuff. His father was, rightfully so, carted off to Azkaban last summer, rather than him being the new recruited member of Voldemort. Even with her logic lecturing her in her mind, Hermione found herself glancing at the sleeve of his Oxford shirt. She squinted, trying to distinguish any sort of black ink underneath the fabric. Her hand crept towards his arm slowly. Hermione jolted, her brain catching up to her movements, and she scowled at her ridiculousness as she picked up her quill again. Her cheeks flamed at the realization she'd practically almost violated Malfoy in his sleep. The shame of her actions reignited her determination, and she promptly turned back to her notes. It was finally a few hours later, as the sun began to set, Hermione estimated it was somewhere around 4 in the evening, that Malfoy awoke. Hermione jumped, her quill scratching through the parchment in her surprise as Malfoy sprang upwards. She was surprised at the flicker of pity she felt when she saw the terrified, panicked glaze of his eyes as he wildly glanced at his surroundings. Malfoy did a double take when he saw just who was sat opposite of him, and his left hand pulled at the sleeve of his shirt reflexively. Hermione's heart shuddered. "What are you doing here, mudblood?" he spat, and Hermione snickered inwardly at the way his voice cracked. Something akin to slick satisfaction spread across her back at the knowledge that she'd caught him off guard. Hermione simply stared at him coolly. "I know you no longer seem to have an interest in education, Malfoy, but surely you can still recognize a library when you're in one." Malfoy sneered at her. "I meant, what are you doing at this table? Was there not enough room anywhere else for you to squeeze that big, ugly, bushy hair of yours?" Any lingering compassion she felt for his exhausted state quickly trickled away. "No, there wasn't," Hermione said, and tapped her wand to fix the tear in her parchment. "And I'm not finished yet, so either you leave, or you can go back to your precious beauty sleep and let me concentrate." She was surprised to see his cheeks prick with color as a pale hand lifted up to wipe away invisible drool from the side of his mouth. "Watching me sleep, Granger? You know, I'd heard rumors about muggles being into kinky, disturbed shit. I should have known your bedroom chase were as filthy as your blood." Malfoy tried to leer at her, but his jaw trembled as he tried to suppress a yawn, effectively ruining any venom his words had had. "Oh, I can think of about 1,000,000 things I do to you, Malfoy, and I can assure you not one of them falls into the realm of kinky," Hermione said as she smiled in a stickly sweet manner, trying to swallow the nausea at the idea of Malfoy being involved in anything intimate. She looked down at her parchment to hide her own blush that began to bloom across her face at that thought. When Malfoy didn't reply nor make any motion to leave for several minutes, she looked back up cautiously. She jumped slightly when her eyes met his. She hadn't even realized he was watching her. His eyes were tight and unreadable, his lips white as they pinched together, looking rather painful. Hermione rolled her eyes. Her quill slapped down onto the table as her patience snapped. "For bloody sake, I didn't do anything to you, Malfoy." Hermione hoped that the blotchiness of her cheeks could have passed for anger, not embarrassment, as she remembered the way she had almost peeked under the sleeve of his shirt. Malfoy didn't look convinced. "I'm supposed to just take your word for it." "Merlin," Hermione huffed a pitiful laugh. "It must be so miserable being a Slytherin, constantly paranoid that someone's out to get you." Malfoy's eyes flickered. With what, Hermione couldn't tell. Before they glazed over briefly, another yawn shuddering out of him before he could suppress it. That treacherous flicker of pity spiked in Hermione's chest again. "I know you live in the dungeons all year round, but I imagine that there are beds in your dormitory, Malfoy," Hermione chided lightly. "You might find it more beneficial to try to sleep there than in a public vicinity. You're no good to anyone if you drop down dead from sleep deprivation." Malfoy blinked, and Hermione tried not to squirm under his pointed gaze as he gave her a thoroughly searching look. "I'm sure you'd be all cut up about it, mudblood," Malfoy said, finally, his voice lacking any real venom, and his shoulders still lightly slumped from fatigue. Malfoy's eyes looked her up and down in a final, suspicious glance, before he reached for his book bag from the seat next to him, slowly rising from his seat. Hermione's hand darted out before she could think twice. The both of them stared down at her hand on his in shock. She didn't know what shocked her more, the fact that she was touching Malfoy, or that he hadn't cursed her hand off yet. Hermione supposed in a sleep-deprived state his reflexes weren't at their usual standards. Her tongue flicked out to wet at her lips nervously as she retracted her hand, and dug around in her back for a few moments. "I mean it, Malfoy." She looked up at him as she placed 2 ginger biscuits she'd smuggled in from the kitchens into his palm. "You need to take care of yourself." Malfoy stared down at the biscuits in his hand, and then back at Hermione, his eyes wide and startled, like he was seeing her for the first time. Hermione's stomach flipped as she tried to smile. It came out as a grimace. "They're not poisoned, but you're welcome to offer Parkinson a bite if you'd like to confirm that for yourself." Malfoy's lips twitched, and Hermione swallowed. Her tongue wet her lips again, before she repeated quietly, "I mean it, Malfoy. You need to find the time to look after yourself." A bitter laugh escaped him, his hands pocketing the biscuits roughly. Malfoy grabbed his book bag as he threw Hermione one last, derisive sneer. "I don't have time, Granger." Narcissa Malfoy was sitting in her office. Hermione was not dating the Malfoy heir, and Narcissa Malfoy was sitting in her office. Her lungs burned as she tried to remember how to breathe. Was it 1 inhale in, 2 exhales out, or maybe it was the other way around? Oh, Merlin, she was going to die of an asthma attack right in front of the Malfoy matriarch. "Miss Granger?" Narcissa greeted cordially, as if Hermione's face wasn't moments away from meeting the floor of her office face. "You're looking well." As well as anyone could, when bombarded with a surprise visit from the mother of the man she was not dating. "Mrs. Malfoy?" Hermione nodded in accordance. Should she have curtsied? Was it improper for her to maintain eye contact? Her fingers dug painfully into the skin of her palms to fight the urge to blush, as she realized Narcissa was sitting on the chair that Hermione had ridden her son silly on not weeks prior. Hermione wasn't sure what was going to give out first, her heart or her lungs. "Please have a seat. No need to be stood on my behalf." She was being invited to sit in her own office. Merlin, she needed to get a grip. Hermione cast a glance at the empty desk next to hers. Draco had oddly spent very little time in her office for the last couple of days. Hermione would go so far as to even say he was somewhat avoiding her. And she couldn't ignore the voice in her head that had pointed out it came as an awfully conveniently close timing to that afternoon at Ginny's. Perhaps Ginny had gotten in touch with Draco, and he was equally baffled at Ginny's conspiracies. Hermione swallowed the bitter hurt at the idea that Draco was so offended that people thought that they were dating, that he would even go so far to ignore Hermione at work. Of course, Hermione had dismissed Ginny's nonsense, but she had no intention of actually letting it affect her relationship, under the category of friends, of course, with Draco. Hermione felt Narcissa's patient eyes on her, and she startled, this time unsuccessful in holding back her heated cheeks. "My apologies, Mrs. Malfoy. I was a million miles away." "Your apologies are not necessary, Miss Granger. My husband was once a ministryman himself, as I'm sure you are aware, so I am quite used to the distracted conversational partner." Her words had no malice as she cast her eyes over the mounds of paperwork around Hermione's desk. "Are you working on anything in particular at this time? Many congratulations on your cockatrice bill, Miss Granger." Hermione blinked. Oh, yes, thank you. Please do call me Hermione." She searched her desk, hoping that any document would grab at her attention. She smiled limply, her paperwork failing at her. "At the moment, I'm investigating March's complaints, specifically from the goblins at Gringotts. I found myself falling quite behind as of late." Narcissa hummed in polite interest, although Hermione suspected the matriarch couldn't give a lick about the temperamental bankers. "And of your Manticore case, have you made progress with your appeal?" Hermione blinked again, slightly taken aback. She thumbed through the folders on her desk. "I know it's here somewhere where, sorry, Miss Malfoy." Hermione looked back up at her, her brows knitted together in confusion. "With all due respect, but how do you know about that?" It had taken every connection Hermione had to keep the reports of a sabotaged bill out of the newspaper. And the woman sat opposite from her was surely intelligent enough not to have the sneak Rita Skeeter as a close companion. "Oh, Draco told me everything," Narcissa interrupted Hermione's thoughts. "He said that you were dreadfully upset about it and wanted to know what his father does to cheer me up when I'm of similarly fragile state." Hermione frowned slightly. True, she had been angry and a little bit teary about the Wizengamot going behind her back, but she wouldn't have said that she was dreadfully upset, certainly not fragile. Draco wanted advice as to cheer me up? Hermione asked incredulously as her brain belatedly processed Narcissa's words. Yes, he was rather put out about the whole situation. Would you consider yourself an autumn or a winter, Miss Granger? Hermione tried not to squirm under Narcissa's inspective gaze, her eyes tracing over Hermione's body. What? My apologies for the abrupt intrusion, but I'm sure you are aware that I did not come here to discuss deadly beasts. Hermione frowned at Narcissa's choice of words and opened her mouth to defend the creatures. They were far too intelligent to be labeled as beasts when, with a wordless flicker of her wand, Narcissa summoned a magical measuring tape, similar to the one the tailor from Hogsmeade had used when designing her jewel ball dress over a decade earlier. Hermione stared perplexed, before she remembered her conversation with Draco the other evening. Ah, right, the engagement party outfit. When Draco said he'd get his mother to sort it out, she'd assumed Narcissa would simply send her an outfit from Diagon Alley. She certainly didn't expect for his mother to show up to take Hermione's sizing personally. A hand surreptitiously pressed against the softness of her stomach as she inwardly cursed her biscuit habit. Would you be so kind as to stand up for me and come this way, Miss Granger? She did so, an embarrassed glance to her open office door as she checked to see if her assistant had returned from her lunch break. She hadn't. Hermione wasn't sure if she was relieved that the office gossip wasn't there to witness Draco's mother paying Hermione a personal visit, or annoyed that she couldn't get Madly to make up an emergency meeting for her to escape to. Narcissa stepped towards her, the tape flittering beside her head, and Hermione internally grimaced as it reminded her of Rita Skeeter and her blasted Quick Notes quill, a contemplative look on her graceful features. I would say you are more of an autumn. It's a pity. Draco is a true winter. Do you have a color preference? Periwinkle, I guess? Hermione felt like she was back in divination class with the woolly theory of it all. Like there was such a thing as a correct color for her skin. If she liked something, she wore it. Hermione's eyes twitched as she tried not to look imploringly towards the paperwork on her desk. Narcissa's mouth twitched in amusement, not unlike that of which Hermione had seen on Draco's face many a time, and Hermione's spine was tight with horror at the idea that Narcissa might be a Legolemens. Hermione looked down towards her feet, her cheeks flushed. Yes, well, I think we should go with a color that will not wash out that lovely complexion of yours, but I will keep that in mind, Narcissa added courteously, the pair of them knowing well enough that she would not. I will ask our family seamstress to keep a record of your measurements, Narcissa said some uncomfortably 20 minutes later, after she had finished moving Hermione's limbs around like a raggedy doll. Oh no, that won't be necessary, thank you, but I can't really see an occasion where it needs something tailor-made for me again. Especially not by the Malfoy seamstress, she added unmentally. Narcissa smirked. Well, at least Hermione knew where Draco had inherited that look from. A Malfoy is always prepared for anything, Miss Granger, Narcissa said simply, the tape disappearing with another fluid wave of her wand. It appeared that Narcissa had mastered the artful aristocratic air of polite indifference, but after 2 years of working in close contact with her son, Hermione easily recognized the minute glint to Narcissa's eyes. A small glimmer of satisfaction that hinted that Narcissa had gotten whatever it was she had been looking for. And Hermione had her sneaking suspicion that it wasn't her measurements. Hermione was ready to throw the hardback in her hands at Draco. Would you just let me buy it for you, you chauvinist? I'm a chauvinist because I'd rather spend my own money. You are if you think you're too proud to let me spend mine. Granger, it's just a bloody book. Ow! Hermione had thwacked the book against his arm. Exactly. You buy me books all the time. What's the problem with me doing the same for you? Draco rolled his eyes. If I let you buy all the books you ever wanted to read, you'd have no money to pay for your rent. And then just where would you and that monster you call a pet live then? I suppose you could always use your books to build a fort. If you let me? Hermione hissed, her eyes narrowed into slits. Draco snatched the book out of her hands and held it high above his head. He smirked when she jumped, her chest brushing against his as she inwardly cursed her short limbs. His other hand snaked around her waist, pulling her hips towards his. Her jumps faltered, her breath quickened slightly when his hand squeezed her hip before coming up to tug playfully at her plate. Now, watch the temper, Granger. We're in public. He hummed a pantomime glance around the bookshop before he returned to grin at her salaciously. Of course, you're more than welcome to take out your frustration in a different way. Should I check if the leaky cauldron has a spare room? Hermione swallowed as her navel quivered, her tongue wetting her lips nervously. She felt a lick of white-hot heat ooze up her spine when Draco watched her movement. The pupils of his eyes expanded slightly, and his lips slightly parted, and her heart stammered against her ribcage. Ginny's words raced through her mind. You'd have to be blind not to see how crazy he is over you. Her eyes widened at her traitorous thoughts, and she jolted back, hoping that her skull covered up the quiet gasp that escaped her. Fine, she said, resisting the urge to stick out her tongue in a childish sneer. Go buy your stupid book, then. Hermione turned on her heel, ignoring Draco's snort of amusement, and walked over to a display where the sole shop assistant was placing the last book. An amused smirk was on the young employee's face. He looked barely out of Hogwarts as he looked between the pair of them, no doubt having overheard their little spat.
Shall I help you with that, sir?
The shop assistant asked Draco, giving Hermione a wink as he walked past her to head to the checkout till. Hermione stared at the blurb of the new paperback, only half registering what the book was about as she focused on her breathing, her irritation settling down and relief rushed over her. At least Draco had stopped ignoring her now. When she'd arrived at her desk this morning, inwardly scowling when she wasn't greeted by a pale, pointy-faced aristocrat, his desk empty for the fourth day in a row, she had made the plan to storm his office at lunchtime. If he wasn't going to come to her over such a silly, nonsensical, not to mention incorrect theory by a heavily pregnant friend, then she would go to him. She had been fantasizing for the third time about dragging him out of his office by his silly locks when there had been a knock at the door around 11 that morning. She jumped and huffed in irritation when she realized she had wasted a whole morning daydreaming about Draco. Said man was at the door and had had the gall to casually ask her if she wanted to join him on a little venture to Diagon Alley during their lunch break, so that he could pick up a book. As if he hadn't been ignoring her existence for the past 3 days. I know that books fill you up more than actual food, Granger. Come and join the world of the socialized for an hour. Draco had spent the entire journey on the way to the bookshop, complaining about the resurgence of the half-vampire clan up in Durham, that he really didn't want to have to go back and deal with being propositioned by Kinkleberry for another month straight. It had been an empty, endless stream of conversation. Hermione hummed and ahed at the right moments, pointedly ignoring the subtle, scrutinizing side glances Draco had sent her way as they walked side by side. His knuckles had brushed against hers too many times for Hermione to consider it accidental, and she offhandedly wondered if this was considered a date. Hermione shook her head and tossed the book back onto the display table. Ginny's ridiculous idea had invaded her mind like weeds, and she'd barely been able to focus on anything else all week. Again, the absurd notion that Hermione had somehow been dating Draco, that Draco was crazy about her, and she hadn't even noticed. Hermione's laugh was like poison in her mouth. She turned on her heel away from the display and her preposterous thoughts, and headed towards the till. Hermione's steps halted, a brick falling in her stomach as Draco's conversation with the store assistant reached her ears.
Your bird is quite a little spitfire. I bet she's a handful in the bedroom, right?
The employee's knowing grin stuttered as Draco, from the angle that Hermione could see, turned a cold glare at him. She shivered. He looked so much like the harsh boy of her teen years. She had forgotten how chilling he could be. If you'd like to keep your job, you won't say another word, and you'll beg that for me. Draco pointed at the book on the desk before his back stiffened almost imperceptibly. His head whipped to the side, and she noticed a slight gleam of panic flicker in his eyes, before his face melted into an open, casual expression. What? No books caught your eyes? My, this must be a first. Should I notify the prophet? The smirk didn't reach his eyes, and she almost missed the way his eyes flitted back to the shop assistants, cautious, defensive. Hermione's smile felt awkward and unfamiliar, like she was wearing somebody else's face, as she walked towards the desk, taking the bag from the shaky hands of the employee. Our lunch hours are messed up, she prompted, and cocked her head to the store entrance. Draco just nodded, not even sparing the teen behind the desk another glance as he stalked out of the bookshop. They walked to the apparition point in silence, and as Hermione focused on picturing the marble flooring of the ministry, Her mind was racing with the conversation she'd overheard, and more specifically, Draco's reaction to the employee's rather inappropriate comment. Whilst he had rather admirably defended her honor by threatening the crude teenager with his livelihood, there was one thing Hermione hadn't failed to notice when she'd be charmingly referred to as his bird. The brick in her stomach was positively leaked. Draco hadn't denied it. Hermione smacked the folder onto her desk with a huff and shoved her face into her hands. She only had until the end of the day to complete the final checks on her cockatrice bill before it was sent off to be officially written into the Wizengamot law, and she still had 23 pages of reading to analyze and compare against her initial proposal. She had less than 7 hours to complete 3 days' worth of work, and all she could think about was Draco. His knuckles brushing against hers, his sexy, wry smirk when he had asked her to dinner last August, his possessive arm around her waist when they slept, the nervous, panicked look in his eye when that teenager had called her his girlfriend, Ginny implying that their stupid, wonderful trip to Greece was an anniversary holiday. Hermione's head throbbed, and burning tears of frustration leaked between her fingers. She did not have time to be stressing over such silly nonsense, and she cursed her brain's need to overanalyze every single piece of information ever given to her. Why was Hermione thinking about this so much? At the beginning of the week, she had fully intended to let Saturday's conversation trickle away from her memory. And yet somehow her mind had clawed its grip into the idea, and it boomed like devil's snare throughout every crevice in her body. Slowly smothered any rebuttal, any logical explanation she could grasp at. "There's no way," Hermione muttered to herself. "Draco wouldn't do that to me."
Did something happen with Mr. Malfoy?
Hermione startled and wheezed out a curse as her spine snapped upwards. Madly, her assistant stood in front of her desk. She hadn't even heard her enter the room. "Laura!" she gasped, a hand clutching at her chest. "Please remember to knock before you enter my office." Madly pursed her lips slightly, her brows furrowed together in concern.
I did knock, Miss Granger. Twice. I managed to track down Mr. Wick's previous complaint submissions to our department and wanted to give you this.
She handed over a thin manila folder.
You were right, it had been dismissed without a singular inquiry into his claims.
Hermione thanked her quietly and placed the folder next to her legislation pile. Another case she had fallen behind on this week. Madeleine glanced at the empty desk next to hers.
Are you and Mr. Malfoy okay, Miss Granger?
She asked, and cocked her chin towards the empty desk.
He hasn't been in this office all week. Did you two have an argument or something? It's just, I think this is the first time in almost a year that he hasn't brought you lunch.
Her vision dotted as all of the blood drained from her face. I'm sorry? Hermione blinked slowly, hoping she was just reading into Madely's words a little too much. No such luck.
It would be just a real shame if something had happened. I know it's not my place to say this. I know the two of you were trying to keep things quiet. I mean, if there's a lesson to be learned about poor Daphne. Oh, she's got a new boyfriend, finally. It's that office relations can be quite tricky.
Madeleine shrugged.
But the two of you, you're good together. My apologies if I'm overstepping, miss.
Hermione held up her hand, and her heart pounded against her chest. Stop. Just stop talking, Laura. Her throat was dry, like sawdust, and she swallowed. She nodded at the thin folder her assistant had handed her, and smiled tightly. I don't have time to sit here and discuss my relationship with Mr. Malfoy. I'm too far behind on my reading, as it is. She tilted her chin towards the door, silently dismissing her assistant. Please, can you contact Mrs. Rotheridge and cancel my meeting this afternoon? Tell her I apologize profusely, but I can't afford to miss this deadline. Hermione waited until Madeleine had closed the door behind her before she let out a wrecked exhale. She must have been experiencing some sort of frequency illusion. How many people had suddenly thought she and Draco were dating? The muggle expression Dad always quoted to her when she was a child went through her mind, a mindset that had helped her discover the truth about dear Professor Lupin's condition back in her 3rd year. Remember, Hermione? Once an accident, twice a coincidence, 3 times a pattern. Ginny, the teenager from the bookstore, and now her assistant. Hermione shook her head, denial angry and blazing in her chest. She couldn't have been that oblivious. Could she? February 2006, Greece. I didn't think it was possible to get sunburned in the winter, Draco. Hermione teased, her shoulders still shaking from laughter as she pointed out that the lobster that he was eating was a lovely matching shade to his nose. Draco scowled at her and flicked a droplet of garlic butter in her direction. You're in no position to make comments, Granger. I can barely see the ocean behind that lion's mane of yours. You know, the humidity charm is only second-year level." He paused to leer at her salaciously. "It would be my pleasure to tutor you when we get back to the villa tonight, if you'd like." Hermione ran a hand through her curls self-consciously, and turned her attention back to the swordfish on her plate, her cheeks flushing. "Petty git," she mumbled to herself as she stabbed at a baby potato with her fork. "Can't even handle a little ribbing. Should let him spend an evening with George, see how he handles." She shoved the potato into her mouth. Her cheeks stuffed and her bottom lip pouted slightly. She was very aware of Draco silently watching her eat for the next few minutes. She blamed the chilly February air for the way that she shivered when her eyes met his, contemplative yet warm. "Did you enjoy the convention?" Draco asked, after she forcibly swallowed her last bite of asparagus. A little too al dente for her taste. Her eyes crinkled as she beamed at him, her hair sparking against her shoulder blades, when she nodded enthusiastically. "It was wonderful," she said, her teeth gnawing on her lips. "I thank you for getting us the tickets, Draco. I don't know how to repay you." She poked at a flake of swordfish, shyly. The delightful melody from the string band twirled and danced in the air surrounding them, as Draco tilted his head, his lips slightly pursed in contemplation. "You could dance with me," Draco offered. "I can what?" Hermione blinked at him, dumbly. "Dance with me?" He cocked his head towards the private balcony beside their table, a breathtakingly stunning view overlooking the Aegean Sea. Hermione looked around the restaurant, shockingly empty despite it being a Saturday night, with a shy, cautious glance. "This is hardly the place. Consider it a late birthday present as well, if you'd like." Hermione quirked a brow. "Your birthday was 7 months ago." "An early one, then." Draco grinned, picking up his napkin from his lap to rest next to his dinner plate. He stood up, his thighs gloriously defined through well-tailored grey trousers, as he circled the table slowly. He held out a hand to her. "I promise not to step on your toes like that oaf Crumb," he smirked when Hermione shot him a warning glare as she clasped their hands together. "Victor was a perfectly capable dancer, thank you very much." Her chin cocked in the air, miffed, as he escorted them towards the balcony. A tremble danced across her spine, as a strong, sturdy arm pulled her close to him, barely a hair's distance between their chests. Hermione's hand shook slightly when she placed it on his shoulder. Her tongue wet her bottom lip, and Draco's eyes darkened as he tracked the movement. His hand tightened briefly on her hips. "Feel free to make comparison notes, Granger," Draco murmured as he began expertly leading her through a slow waltz in perfect timing to the melody from the restaurant. At some point between the second and third song, Hermione's head found itself resting at the nook of Draco's shoulder, and as Draco's chin turned to rest against her head as they swayed, she couldn't help but think of how perfectly her body fit into his. Later that night, Draco brought her over the edge again and again, until she was a limp mess in his strong, secure embrace. His lips mapped across every inch of her skin, sweet, empty nothing spilling from his lips as he claimed her body over and over. Draco mouthed something inaudibly against her shoulder, pausing to kiss across her collarbone every so often, and Hermione gasped and backed with every precise shift of his hips. His mouth covered hers hotly as he followed her in a shared, soul-scorching release. Her name never sounded quite as beautiful as it did when falling from his gaping lips. Hermione found herself limply being pulled back into Draco's arms after he slipped out of her, with his hot, exhausted pants wet against her hair. She could feel his heartbeat race as she rested against his sweaty chest. Draco's fingertips painted invisible patterns against her back, and Hermione's eyes widened in surprise as a treacherous voice whispered from the back of her mind how badly she wanted to stay in that moment in his arms forever. There were 3 things Hermione was sure of. 1. She would never let George Weasley babysit her children. 2. Red wine definitely went best with tomato pasta. And 3, that she was definitely not dating Draco Malfoy. And yet, as she looked around the living room, at the green velvet ottoman she didn't remember purchasing, the 14th century wizarding texts on her bookshelves, the hideous and obnoxiously ostentatious grandfather clock that could only belong to a Malfoy. She pictured the toothbrush next to hers on her bathroom counter, and it wasn't even the cheap emergency gas toothbrush she would purchase from her muggle supermarket. The old Slytherin quidditch jersey she regularly tripped over in her bedroom, and the mint chocolate chip ice cream in her freezer, a flavor Hermione absolutely abhorred, but that a particular pale, pointy-faced aristocrat sat across from her had a tragic fondness for her. And it's as if the floodgates opened up in her mind, dozens of memories lighting up like stray Lumos charms. Parkinson's invitation with Hermione's name personally embroidered in navy blue silk, and delivered to her personally because she was the quickest way of passing along the notice. Crookshank's wine as Draco refused to let him into their bad. Draco's name in jet-black ink on her contract form as her emergency contact. Draco setting up the warts in her flat night after night. Narcissa taking Hermione's measurements in her office because Draco said he would have his mother sort it out for them, and it being a true shame that Hermione and Draco's color palette didn't line up. Draco asking his mother how his father would cheer her up, his wife, because he didn't like seeing Hermione so upset over the Wizengamot's backstabbing. It's his arm around hers as they explored the beautiful side of Greece, the soft kiss at the back of her neck every morning and night, him rocking her gently back and forth in his arms after she'd contacted him, and it dawned on Hermione that she hadn't even thought twice about it when Crookshanks was ill, and holding her as she cried all night long. It's his private smile whenever she finished the lunches he prepared for her, a smile that she saw almost every day for nearly a year. It was Harry's voice, genuine and open, surprised and confused as to why she hadn't brought Draco to a private, loved ones only event on bonfire night. It was Dorothy's wistful sigh as she lamented wanting her boyfriend to be as attentive as Draco. It was the shop assistant, an amused knowing grin on his face as he bantered with Draco about his Spitfire bird. It was Ginny, pleading, but firm as she insisted Hermione had to be blind not to see how he felt about her. And it's as if the veil of a notice-me-not charm had been lifted from her eyes. All of these moments that had been practically screaming in her face for a whole year, and Ginny was right. Hermione had been blind to it all. She hadn't known a damn thing. Hermione had been so focused on her work, angrily shoving away any distracting thoughts she had had over her growing feelings for her co-worker, the guilt that she had felt towards her cases. Whenever she found herself drifting off into fantasies, the jealousy, Hermione now acknowledged it to be, when Draco was cozying up to that inappropriate healer at St. Mungo's, the way she had to bite her lip to hold back her tears whenever sex with Draco got a little too intimate. She had spent months exhausting herself, denying her true feelings, and using that guilt to fuel her fight for her cases. And Draco had been there through it all. The knowing smirks, the private grins, the glint in his eyes whenever he cracked a joke about her not having time. Because it was a joke, wasn't it? Whilst Hermione gave her blood, sweat, and tears, quite literally in the Manticore case, into her job, insistent on the fact that she couldn't afford to have any distractions, convincing herself that she didn't have the time to date anyone, Draco had slithered his way through the cracks, manipulating her life to ensure he got what he wanted anyway. A Malfoy is always prepared for anything, Miss Granger. Narcissa's silken tone echoed through her. Hermione exhaled shakily, and barely registered her book slipping through her shaken fingers onto her lap, as the overwhelming and consuming painful truth that Draco had indeed betrayed her trust and lied to her for over a year hit her. She felt like her heart was being trampled on by a herd of centaurs, and he was just sat there reading the Quidditch scores, oblivious to the anguish that was obliterating every cell in her body. Her chest burning as if she had drank an entire barrel of boober-tuber pus, Hermione turned to him with narrowed, accusing eyes. "Malfoy," she said, her voice quiet with barely concealed rage, realizing that it had been almost a year since she had last called him that after he looked up at her in confusion. "Are we dating?" Like pouring fire whiskey onto the raging flames of anger in her chest, Draco had the nerve to only look mildly sheepish.
Thank you for listening to today's chapter of Once More with Feelin by Wetpretzel, read by Elmix Marbella. If you would like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on AO3, YouTube, or Tumblr. Thank you to Wetpretzel for letting me read their story, and thank you to all of you for listening.